Okay, today we're going to talk about some more European developments, largely what Napoleon Bonaparte does as leader of France. That will precipitate a lot of big changes, not just in Europe, but will also push a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies to get involved in these events that will create a kind of power vacuum that several of the colonies will use as an opportunity for rebellion to break away and become their own independent countries. So today is really setting the political stage in Europe for why that power vacuum exists in Spain and Portugal, especially as we get into the 18 teens. But first, we have to go back and talk about Napoleon a little bit and how he gets into power and what his policies are and what the long term effect of that will be for the colonies. So remember, we've said a couple times now that Napoleon was a French general and the most successful and by far the most famous French general who won several battles and several wars against much larger other European forces in the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. So he was one of the most famous kind of government figures in France by the late 1790s. Even though he's not a politician himself, he's this very young, kind of charismatic, ambitious, and in a lot of ways very aggressive general who has a lot of popular support because he's really one of the few success stories of the French government by the late 1790s. After the Reign of Terror ended, the French government that replaces it is very kind of careful and cautious, and they make a lot of pretty bad economic mistakes. They get involved in new wars that end up being big mistakes. So Napoleon is really one of the kind of bright spots in French politics. So he gains a lot of support just because of that. And he uses that support, and especially the die-hard loyalty of many of his troops, to overthrow the French government in December 1799. So he launched a military coup where he basically arrested all those government leaders over the course of a couple of days, threw them all in jail, and declared a new government led by the military. So this became known as the consular government, and because the executive branch were the so-called consuls, there were three of them. But Napoleon set himself up as what became known as the first consul, which means he had most of the executive branch power. So he ran the police forces and the military and the law enforcement. So that's his job, and very quickly pushed the other two consuls out, so he becomes the only consul. So in 1800, he is appointed to be this first consul, the only consul, for a 10-year term. So his term of office will last until 1810. And in those years, he's going to do several gigantic, important things for France internally by writing constitution and developing all these policies. And he's also going to lead France in international wars. So the biggest thing internally that Napoleon does for France, it becomes known as the Napoleonic Code, or the Code Napoleon, in 1804. So theoretically he wrote this thing himself and publicized it and said he would enforce it, but it's really him and his highest advisors who come together. And the big attempt seems to be at this point that he is going to promise the French people that as their leader he will uphold the gains of the French Revolution. So he wants to end feudalism and guarantee that that never comes back. He wants to create full citizenship for the French people and kind of legal citizen equality under the law, to again remove any vestiges of feudalism and the old kind of nobility privileges system. Another thing he wants to do is create a government bureaucracy that employs professional bureaucrats, basically. People that have gone to school and they have learned about what kind of job they're going to be doing for the government. So if you want to be a government-appointed kind of officer within the government to run a specific department like tax collecting or bridge building or road maintenance or whatever, you're going to have to pass a test to take that office, to function in that office. And the test is designed to ensure that you actually know what you're doing. Because a lot of governments in Europe and around the world previously, they just appointed people from wealthy families. So if the king had certain landowners that were his friends, he would appoint the children of those friends into the government, even though those children might be very kind of uneducated and have no idea what the job entails or how to do it. So that led to all kinds of government problems. And one thing about the modern world for government is that a lot of civilizations have figured out that you have to test your bureaucrats. Otherwise, you could have a kind of giant government disaster on your hands if they don't know what they're doing. They run into problems they don't know how to solve. So Napoleon gets on that policy and puts it into the Napoleonic Code. He also promised full religious toleration and freedom to virtually all religions in France. He would later make deals with the Catholic Church to bring Catholicism back into France, which pleased a lot of conservatives who tended to be Catholic in the country, and they wanted the church back because the French Revolution had basically destroyed the church by taking its lands in the 1790s. So a lot of political conservatives and Catholics in France were very happy that he put that in the Napoleonic Code. And other parts of the Napoleonic Code, a little less important for this class, but he's takes a very conservative stance against labor unions and gender roles. So the idea is that workers should do their jobs and women should do their social jobs, which are basically patriarchy, stay in the house and take care of the kids and do what your husband says and all that kind of junk. Another important thing from the Napoleonic Code is that he's largely going to set this thing up in all the places he will eventually conquer and otherwise control. So the Napoleonic Code will spread out from France, especially in Western Europe, very far and wide, because he's going to make these similar promises to the other countries that he conquers in order to get those populations on his side. So he can continue ruling over them basically as a European-wide empire, but we'll get into his military moves a little bit later. So a lot of these ideas and his promises are fairly popular in France. So when Napoleon is first in office in 1799, for the first 5 years or so, the French actually like him pretty well. He's promising to uphold the gains of the Revolution, which was pretty popular amongst the people that were still in France, at least. So he has this 10-year term of office, and he's so popular in 1802, just 2 years into his 10-year term, the French Assembly, the elected representatives, the legislature, give him a lifetime appointment to be consul for life. So he, under that title, will run the executive branch for the rest of his life. But Napoleon, being who he is, he's very ambitious and kind of power hungry. He's not even happy just with being consul for life in 1802. So a couple years later, he has himself crowned Emperor of the French. So he is now the monarch of France. And this is where a lot of French people start to turn against him, because you can't say that you uphold the gains of the revolution by getting rid of the elite, the nobility, and all their privileges, and then crown yourself basically king. So those two ideas don't work very well together, and this is when a lot of the kind of French intellectuals and political class that want democracy, this is where they turn against him and say that what he really is a power-hungry politician. So Napoleon starts, immediately after declaring himself emperor, he starts doing fairly repressive things against the French population. Number one, he shuts down any newspapers or any printers that tend to publish things that are critical of him and his government. So within a few months of declaring himself emperor, he shuts down 60 newspapers out of France's 73 that existed. So he shut down the mass majority of French newspapers in the country and started to build up internal spy networks to watch over the French population, to read their mail, their private letters that they're writing back and forth, which was obviously the big way of communicating back then was on the written page. So he's trying to read people's mail who his government feels are involved in like suspicious activity or something like that. A lot of times they don't have any evidence for it, so it's really going into the private lives of the French people, which harms their citizenship rights and whatnot. And the government will also send spies out into the average society to kind of sit in coffee houses and bars and hang out in public places and just listen to what people are saying. And they'll start writing down lists of names of people who express like anti-government sentiment or something like that. So there's this extensive spy network in France spying on its own population, looking for kind of statements that might be cause for watching someone more closely or even throwing them in jail. The government also bans a lot of books, especially political philosophy books that, like these Enlightenment books we've talked about, that speak out against monarchy and oppression and all those types of things. So Napoleon's government, after 1804, turns fairly repressive against his own French people. And another problem that Napoleon will face pretty quickly is the reemergence of a coalition of European countries that want to start a war against him and start attacking again. So the so-called Second Coalition rises pretty quickly in 1799 when he started all this, when he promoted himself and started the coup in the first place. So there is a war from 1799 going into the early 1800s, and it's largely like the first coalition. It's a whole bunch of different powerful European countries that all agree to attack France at the same time. For Spain and its government, the Spanish king, in a move I've never personally been able to understand, brought back that prime minister who made a ton of mistakes in the 1790s and really destroyed the Spanish government in a lot of ways by getting involved in those wars in the 1790s, which proved to be a disaster. For some reason, the Spanish king brings this guy back and reappoints him to be a prime minister again in 1801. And that will have gigantic effects on France. So Godoy is going to be back, and he's going to continue making a lot of really dumb mistakes. So again, it's always a mystery why anyone trusts this guy at all. So Godoy's foreign policy is really important. When Napoleon starts fighting this first coalition, Napoleon generally wins that war by 1802. And there's a peace treaty signed between France and its various enemies in 1802 called the Peace of Amiens. And this has direct impacts on Spain itself. So Spain got involved in all this, and in this peace treaty, Napoleon forced Spain to be an ally of France for the long term. And Godoy goes along with it. And in order to end the war, Spain has to pay off a lot of France's enemies, especially Britain, by giving some of its Caribbean colonies, some of these tiny little islands, to Britain and some of the other powers. So a lot of Spanish people see that as absolutely humiliating. And furthermore, somehow Godoy allowed Napoleon the right to basically run Spanish foreign policy. So Napoleon, the French leader, is going to decide when Spain goes to war and how many troops it's going to send. So that basically is going to make Spain into a puppet of Napoleon, and Spain is under this kind of alliance is going to be dragged into Napoleon's wars for years and years. That'll do a lot of damage to France. And not only is Napoleon getting that power over France, but over Spain, but Spain has to pay to allow Napoleon to rule them. So that's an even greater level of just insanity. So Spain has to pay yearly tribute, basically a giant tax to France, I guess as a thank you payment for Napoleon being able to run their country. So this is so humiliating to almost everybody in France that right when this peace treaty is announced, Godoy is, his name's dragged through the mud in Spain itself, and a giant anti-Godoy faction breaks out in Spanish politics. It basically says that Godoy is completely untrustworthy, and the guy who appointed him is also completely untrustworthy, and that's the king. So for Spanish people to say that about their own king is a whole new kind of realm of disbelief that a lot of Spanish people had never even considered getting involved in the centuries before. So Godoy has taken the Spanish kind of political ideology into a whole new dangerous place. So a lot of Spanish people start saying that their own sitting king doesn't know what he's doing, and they start saying that the king has to resign and make his son the heir to the throne, the next king, and they start believing that the heir to the throne is going to be like their great political savior, the guy's a genius and all these kinds of things. But it seems to be, historians mostly think, more kind of desperate thinking amongst the Spanish, as they're literally desperate to get the leaders that are making all these horrible mistakes out of office and try to start something new. Spain also, under Godoy, starts doing some questionable things in its colonies. And these questionable things include ending its major kind of colonial economic reform system, because Godoy says that Spain is in crisis, basically, this military and economic crisis. So they don't have the luxury of kind of testing out a lot of these economic theories and reforms. So Godoy shuts down those reforms and tries to go back to the old taxation system in order to suck as much tax revenue out of the colonies as possible, because the Spanish government itself in Spain is going through a series of financial crises. Of course, the colonies didn't like that very much. Most colonists didn't like this very much, which tended to harm the kind of relationship between the colonies and Spain. And a lot of colonists start growing very angry in these years. And then you have to consider that the Spanish government under Godoy, because it can't pay its bills, it's having these financial crises, continues borrowing increasing amounts of money and issuing bonds, eventually that total twice the size of the revenue, the tax revenue that the government takes in on a yearly basis. So the government has borrowed basically twice its income level on a yearly basis, which causes all kinds of it's basically a financial disaster. So if you add the amount of borrowing that Godoy and the government is doing to the fact that they have to pay this yearly tribute to France, to Napoleon, this basically bankrupts the Spanish government. So the Spanish government's in a very, very difficult position after 1802, and Godoy and even the king are increasingly unpopular, even in Spain itself. And Napoleon is still kind of looking around for what he wants to do next in the world. And Napoleon at this point starts thinking very, very big. He's extremely confident. He's basically he's defeated the Second Coalition. He is now on the road to proclaiming himself the Emperor of the French and solidifying his rule over the country. And he starts thinking on a worldwide scale, basically. He wants France to become the most powerful country in the world, bar none, by far. So he starts looking at the globe and imagining how he can build all of the kind of important, wealthy, useful places in the world into a worldwide French empire. So he decides that he wants to not just control all of Europe, but he wants to control all of Egypt and India and the Caribbean, and if he can, all of North America also. So Napoleon is thinking very, very big at this point. And he starts putting plans into effect to raise the armies and start the conflicts that will, he thinks, get him to that level of being really a worldwide emperor. So one of his big projects is to start this, what he thinks will be a French empire in North America. And he wants to base that empire, he wants its capital city to be in Louisiana, in the city of New Orleans. So another thing about the peace treaties that he and the Spanish are getting involved with in the early 1800s is that he forces Spain to give Louisiana back to France as a colony in 1801. And of course, Godoy is forced into this position and he signs off on it. So Louisiana is a French colony again in 1801. And Napoleon is also thinking that, well, if I can somehow tend to use Louisiana as a power base, I might be able to dominate the United States, because the United States is still a very kind of weak country at that point. And if Napoleon has control over Spain, he might be able to use that control to influence the Spanish colonies, at least in North America, especially on this map you see out there in the west called New Spain. Um, and Napoleon also figures he can try to leverage all that power in the North American continent to try to take over a lot of the Caribbean islands. And he wants to start off with Saint Domingue, which, if you remember, has declared itself to be an independent government by the early 1800s, or is on that road to, is fighting wars to try to accomplish that under the black generals. So this is where Napoleon decides to send a giant army to Saint Domingue to destroy those black armies, those former slave-based armies, and basically take over the island again. And because it's one of the wealthiest islands, obviously, in the whole world, he thinks he can use that island as a power base to kind of launch off on other attacks and possibly conquer the rest of the Caribbean. So Napoleon is thinking very, very big by this point, 1801, 1802. And he does send his army into Saint Domingue to try to conquer the island, as we talked about a couple times ago. That fails pretty miserably for a whole bunch of different reasons, a whole list. And in 1803, Napoleon basically realizes that he's lost the war in Saint Domingue, and his dreams of a North American Caribbean empire are not going to happen. So at that point, he's still fighting other stuff going on in around the world, really. So he needs some money to fund his other wars around the world. So he decides to sell Louisiana completely to the United States in 1803. So the American diplomats, they thought they were negotiating at first in 1803 to buy just the city of New Orleans and the kind of surrounding land around New Orleans. And they were absolutely shocked when Napoleon offered to sell all of Louisiana for not a whole lot more money. So, of course, the American diplomats jumped at it and signed the deal. So this becomes known as the Louisiana Purchase in U.S. history. And as you can see by looking at the map, it doubles the size of the United States overnight. So that all becomes U.S. territory. And that will help launch the United States off on a conquest of much of the rest of the continent by the mid-1800s. And that will be the basis of really American power ever since. So, but in 1803, Napoleon has these other problems. He's fighting wars all over the world. And one of his biggest problems is that Britain declares war again in 1803, and that's what convinced him to really sell Louisiana. So Napoleon has to start developing plans about how he's going to defeat Britain in this new war. And his giant plan is to build up a gigantic French and Spanish army. And he starts doing that in 1803. And Napoleon is very good at building armies quickly and training them and making them, kind of molding them into some of the most powerful fighting forces in the world. He's really a genius at that stuff. So Napoleon builds what he calls the Grand Army, the Grande Armée. And he's building it in France for the most part, but also in Spain, because Spain is his ally. So he's building up this gigantic force. The problem, though, is that Britain is an island. So at the same time, he has to build up an armada, a whole bunch of naval ships, to put the soldiers on to get them to Britain. And in order to get them to Britain, Napoleon's navy has to defeat the British navy somewhere out in the oceans. So as this is going on over a couple years, he's preparing his army, he's building up his navy, and finally he sends his navy out to battle the British navy. And the biggest battle happens at a place called Trafalgar, which is just off of the kind of southwestern Spanish coastline, as we see on this map. And the result of the battle is that the British force just completely annihilates the combined Spanish and French navy that showed up to fight at Trafalgar. So at that point, with his navy pretty much annihilated, that he'd spent 2 years building, Napoleon is forced to admit that he will not be able to invade Britain with his giant grand army. And he has to figure out, well, if I can't directly invade Britain, then how am I going to defeat them in this war? And the idea he hits on is to control as many other parts of Europe as possible and to force them to boycott Britain. And that means that he's going to have to, again, control the territories of Europe as much as he can. And he's going to try to control their economies. And his theory is that Britain is a trade-based empire. That if you can destroy the British economy, you will destroy the British government's tax revenue. And if they don't have money, then they won't be able to build boats and keep an army in the field. And that's how you're going to defeat them. It's basically economic warfare. So the boycott is designed as a refusal to buy any British goods or any goods that have traveled through British ports, to deny Britain that tax revenue and take down their whole national economy. So that launches us into the next phase, which is called the Continental System, because the Continental System is his plan for the boycott. And again, it really depends very heavily on controlling as much of the European mainland as he possibly can. That's what I like about this map. After 1805, he starts doing whatever he can to control all these governments all around Europe. So some of them he has kind of standing treaties with because he's already intimidated or invaded those countries and forced them to his will. So the formal French Empire that is under his direct control as leader of the French government is in the darkest green area here on the map. And you can see the French Empire has already expanded beyond France's normal boundaries. So he's conquered the Netherlands all the way up to Denmark in the north. He's conquered about half of Italy and declared it part of the French Empire. And again, Italy is not a unified country at that point. And he's also invaded even further east out into the Germanies and has kind of helped set up so-called independent governments all through the Germanies, but they have to form alliances with him. So he will also control their foreign policy, just like he controls the foreign policy of Spain. So from Spain all the way toward the Austrian Empire, which is here in purple in the kind of middle of Europe, and the Russians much further to the east, Napoleon has pretty much direct control over all the areas in dark and lighter green. And he, the Austrians and the Russians are so afraid of him because he's just seen as this giant unbeatable general, the military genius of his age, that he's often able to kind of force them into treaties or something where they agree to join this European-wide boycott, the Continental System. So there's really very few kingdoms or empires in all of Europe that are able to retain any amount of economic independence after 1805. So Napoleon's going to start implementing this Continental System, which quite honestly does more damage in Europe than it does to Britain, because a lot of European markets and businesses depended on trade, on buying and selling with the British Empire. So it really did a whole lot of damage to the European economy, which angered a lot of people, obviously, in Europe, and they start to say, this is not a good idea, but they can't stop it because he has control over their government somehow. So a lot of Europeans start to look at Napoleon as a tyrant and an oppressor. As we get closer to 1810 and then going further on from there. So the Continental System kind of formally gets started in 1807. And Napoleon's big problem is really whenever an independent king stands up and says, my country's not going to participate in this giant boycott of Britain. And the most famous one that rises up pretty quickly when the Continental System gets going is the King of Portugal. I mean, he flatly says Portugal's not going to take part in this. So what is Napoleon's response? He takes a big French army and marches them from France through Spain and into Portugal to overthrow the Portuguese government and completely just take it over. Now, the Portuguese king and his advisors realized they didn't have a big enough army to possibly resist this giant French army that's coming in. So the Portuguese king and his advisors and their families and their adherents and their servants and whatnot, they all pack up and they leave Portugal and they go to Brazil. So they go to the South American colony. A large amount of them, about 15,000 government officials, leave Portugal and they go to Brazil, and they set up their government in Brazil, and they still claim to be the official Portuguese government, but they don't have much power in Portugal anymore. And the Portuguese king and his people, they're going to be in Brazil for quite a long time, from really 1807 until 1821. So that's 14 years that they're really in exile, waiting for better circumstances to come back to Portugal. These are giant problems that are happening in Portugal, and Napoleon does basically conquer the Portuguese government and kind of forces it into his continental system and angers virtually the whole Portuguese population. So a lot of Portuguese people will start a resistance movement in Portugal to try to basically launch small-scale attacks wherever they can against Napoleon's forces and try to convince them to leave Portugal. The problem in Spain is that Godoy and some of Godoy's kind of followers, they're in a very difficult position. They don't like these French armies marching through Spain to get to Portugal, and they don't like the idea that they've overthrown the Portuguese government, basically. So, but Godoy has this treaty with Spain, or with France, between Spain and France, so he can't really speak out very publicly against Napoleon for having done all this stuff. And a giant kind of spontaneous riot happens in one of the Spanish cities where Godoy is, where there's just so much hatred of this guy amongst the Spanish people in this town that they riot in the town and they almost kill him. He barely escapes. And these riots they start growing. And the only way Godoy knows of, and the king, Charles IV, knows of, to kind of calm the rioters and end this just upheaval in the country is to force Godoy out of power. So these riots start happening in 1808, and Godoy is forced out of office. He is forced to resign in 1808, so he's out. So the Spanish king forced him out. And then quickly after that, Charles IV himself, he abdicates, which means he officially retires. So he's out in March of 1808. He's gone. And he appoints his son the next king. And this guy becomes known as Ferdinand VII. So he's now in power in March 1808 as the official king of Spain. But he doesn't last long because Napoleon, after taking over Portugal, Napoleon realizes that Spain could be a kind of hotbed of kind of anger against what France is doing. So Napoleon doesn't even trust Ferdinand VII. And Napoleon at this point basically tries to take over the Spanish government completely. And the textbooks and historians are a little bit divided on exactly what Napoleon does. Some historians argue that Napoleon just offered a gigantic bribe to Ferdinand VII to basically come to France and to bring his father, the former king, and Godoy with him. So they all go to France, and they are basically put up in a very kind of luxurious exile in France. So they're put up in a nice French palace, and they're paid these huge bribes to not complain about it. That's one interpretation. Some other historians argue that Napoleon just went in with some troops and arrested them and brought them to France and put them basically under a house arrest in a French palace, and maybe gave them some money to, be quiet about it. So there's a kind of different interpretations of exactly what happened here, depending on which exact textbook or documentary you're reading or watching, or which historian you're talking to. But what is very clear is that by May 1808, even Ferdinand VII is out, And Napoleon has to find someone to run Spain for him. So Napoleon appoints his younger brother, Joseph, to be king of Spain. So a lot of Spanish people don't like this at all, because now they have a French guy as their king. So this becomes extremely unpopular in Spain itself, to the point that Napoleon has to keep sending French troops to Madrid, to basically conquer Madrid, the Spanish capital, and keep his brother on the Spanish throne. And since this is a new government starting, Napoleon and Joseph Bonaparte, they meet with their advisors and they write up a new constitution for Spain that creates a representative legislature. But the monarch Joseph is going to have pretty much all the power in his own hands. So the legislature is kind of a rubber stamp. They're not really all that important. But the important thing about the legislature and the Constitution is that the legislature will include representatives from all of the Spanish colonies. And the Constitution says it will give equal rights to not just the people in Spain, but also the Spanish colonizers out in the colonies. So people in the Spanish colonies will also be viewed as kind of equal citizens with the Spanish people in Spain themselves. So it's going to kind of erase a lot of those distinctions. So a lot of the Spanish colonies, they like this constitution to a certain extent. They don't like who wrote it, or that the French are still running Spain itself. But they'll use these ideas of full equality for the colonists as a kind of jumping off point to argue for, after they say we're going to try to get rid of these French guys running Spain, but even after we get rid of them, the precedent has been set that the colonies are equal to the home country itself. So they're going to start arguing for kind of more power and more decision making in the Spanish government, even after, they say, after they get rid of the Bonapartes. So these kind of representative ideas and these equality ideas will reverberate throughout the Spanish colonies long after Napoleon and Joseph are taken out. So going back to Europe, though, Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and his coup against Spain to gain control of those two countries really incited a giant revolution amongst many people living in Spain and Portugal, the Iberians. They come to see the French as kind of evil occupiers and usurpers, and they want to start basically a peninsula-wide revolution to destroy French power and kick them out so that Spain and Portugal can govern themselves again. So this idea even spreads into the colonies also, because again, a lot of the colonists, they look at the French as kind of these power-hungry, controlling tyrants. So a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies are very much in line with the home population, saying that they should all unite to destroy French power over Portugal and Spain, and to kick the French out. But a lot of people in the colonies will start talking about, if we're going to be involved in this giant revolution against the Bonapartes, then we should, have some kind of ability to run our own colony instead of waiting for orders from Spain. So there's a lot of kind of Spanish and Portuguese nationalism going on even in the colonies. But even as they start to say, in return for helping you do this in Europe, we're going to want some more power over our own colonies for the long term. But we also have to remember that a lot of colonists, they, even when they want the power to make their own decisions in their colonies about tax rates or trade policy or something like that, they still say that they have loyalty to the Spanish king, whoever he is. And most of them are now recognizing Ferdinand VII as the legitimate Spanish king. So their statement is really, we're going to start these revolutions against France in our colony, and we're going to start to run our colony ourselves a little bit more, but it's still going to be under the permission of the Spanish king. So they still claim loyalty to the Spanish king. So even though they might talk about revolution and running themselves, they're not talking about fully breaking away from the Spanish Empire and creating independent countries. That is not on the table for most of the colonists. And of course, France's enemies, especially Britain, sees all this revolutionary sentiment in Iberia and in the colonies as a great opportunity to weaken Napoleon. So Britain will start intervening in these revolutionary movements in Portugal and Spain against France because they see it as a good way to hurt France. So Britain will start sending a lot of money. They'll send soldiers and supplies into Iberia to help these resistance movements grow as much as they can possibly get them to flourish. And they basically view it as a good way to force Napoleon to keep sending more and more French troops into Iberia to try to retain control over Portugal and Spain. So the Spanish people, again, they generally hate Napoleon and his brother. They view the overthrow of the Spanish and Portuguese governments as basically coups run by France to just enrich and empower themselves. So a lot of individual Spanish towns and cities basically spontaneously start declaring war on France on the town and city level within a year of the kind of overthrow of their monarchs, their governments. So 1807 and 1808 sees the kind of growing list of all these towns and cities throughout Iberia that are formally declaring war against France, taking it upon themselves because they know their national government's not going to do it because a Bonaparte is sitting on their throne. And Napoleon is very worried about this. And he's especially worried about it spreading to the colonies. So Napoleon will send some of his kind of representatives and agents to the colonies to convince the Spanish and Portuguese colonies to not do this, to not get involved in this revolutionary war, to just kind of stay quiet and stay out of it. But the colonists themselves, they know what Napoleon's up to when these French government diplomats basically arrive in their colony, and the colonists hate those French people. They view them for really what they are is just agents trying to just take total control over all Spain and its colonies for the long term. So a lot of the colonists actually arrest these Spanish diplomats coming into the colonies. Just throw them in jail right off the bat so that they cannot make any deals with the colonists. And some colonists they turn on their own colonial leaders, their own political leaders in the colonies, like the viceroys, because they accuse them of taking French bribes or making secret deals with the French or something like that. So several viceroys are kind of kicked out of office or even jailed themselves just by popular demand of the colonists. So this starts a kind of large split in colonial opinion as a result of these independence and revolutionary wars that are getting going in, especially in 1808 in Spain. And this is an image of famous painting by one of the most famous Spanish artists of the time, basically of several of the Spanish resistance members have been captured by French forces and they're being executed. They're just being shot right there on the spot. And it's an image where you see the guy in the middle with the white shirt basically saying, I love my country, so you might as well shoot me, just I have no fear of this. So it's a big kind of nationalistic type painting. And you can see that the French soldiers, you can't even see their faces, so they're kind of covered up and they're kind of portrayed in the shadows to make them look bad, to make them look evil. But this is largely the feeling that a lot of Spanish people had for what the French are doing in Spain and Portugal and attempting to do in the colonies. So all this will really start to split a lot of colonial opinion on what should the colonists be doing, what should their policy be during all of these conflicts. So the colonists, especially in the Spanish colonies, they largely split into three different kind of factions. One faction is called the Loyalists. So they are completely dedicated to the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII. They say that monarchy is good, the Spanish king is good. We just got to get him back on the throne to put things back the way they should be. So these loyalists, they like monarchy. They think it's the best government system, basically. There's another group who become known as the autonomists. And they say that they do like the Spanish king. They want to see him back on the throne in Spain. But they want to kind of govern their colonies more locally. They want more local power to make decision for their own colonies to set policy. So the autonomists want more kind of home rule over the colony, but they still want to stay a colony within the overall Spanish Empire, loyal to the Spanish king. And the third group are the real radicals of all this. They want to start a revolution and completely break the colony away from the Spanish Empire and proclaim full independence as a completely new country. So these so-called separatists, they want to separate from the Spanish Empire and go for full independence. They are the most radical, seen as the most extreme in the colonies. And a lot of the colonists are, their general populations are fairly conservative by this point. So the loyalists and the autonomists were probably the majority of the colonial populations, at least amongst the kind of Spanish European elite that are in the colonies. And many historians write that the kind of native and racial revolts in the late 1700s really contributed a lot to this, because a lot of those loyalists and autonomists who want to stay in the empire, they say that that kind of chaos is what happens when you get rid of monarchy and you basically destabilize the government. So their argument is we need monarchy for stability. So we need that Spanish king, and we need that that tie to the rest of the Spanish Empire in order to keep the chaos of native revolt and racial massacre and racial infighting, racial civil war, basically. We need to keep that out of the colony, so we want to keep the government nice and stable, so they like monarchy. And the next section is really that as word continues to grow of Spanish rebellion and Portuguese rebellion, 1808 largely, against Napoleon and the French government's attempt to take over the Iberian countries, there's this just spontaneous and very quickly growing revolutionary sentiment and declarations of war from different towns throughout Portugal and Spain, saying that they're going to dedicate themselves to kicking the French out. And of course, Britain will give them massive money and support and supplies, and even once in a while send in a British army to try to help the Portuguese and the Spanish attack the French army in Iberia and kick them out. But the French army keeps winning the battles, basically, against the revolutionaries and the British in Iberia. So the French army keeps returning into Spain year after year and fighting off the resistance. So for a while, the French armies are pretty successful at that. And all this is very, very destructive. In Portugal alone, these wars kill about 250,000 people. So about 250,000 people are killed in this fighting. And you can see how Portugal is only like 25% of the overall landmass of Iberia. So these wars are very destructive, very bloody. They destroy not just people and families, they destroy the economy, they destroy transportation lines, they destroy trade networks, and it really destroys the Iberian economy. And the Portuguese government has to borrow huge amounts of money to keep these resistance movements and these wars going. So even after the war ends, Portugal will be in a very, very kind of difficult, indebted position to people who had lent it money, and they're going to remain in that position for quite a while. So a group called the Central Junta will become the kind of central decision-making and military coordinating body for all these various revolutions and rebellions going on throughout the peninsula. So the central junta is kind of the central Spanish and Portuguese politicians and kind of head generals. That's where the planning occurs. So they're like the kind of default Spanish government for people that want to fight this kind of revolutionary war. And most of Spanish, they do call it a revolution. It's generally known as the War of Independence in Spanish history. And it starts in 1808 and goes for quite a while. A lot of the English-speaking world call it something different. Like the British call it the Peninsular War. And you can see that down in the kind of corner of the map here. So that's how the British think of it. This is just one war fought in this one peninsula as compared to the other areas that Britain is fighting against Napoleon really around the world by this point. So the Central Junta, they work closely with the colonies at first, but the colonies have they have their own interests, to put it mildly. So they don't really coordinate that well with the Central Junta, and the Central Junta kind of gets into arguments with the colonies over its 2 years, and the Central Junta basically accuses the colonists very often just of acting in their own interest, whereas the colonists say, no, we're doing what we can because we love the Spanish king. We're acting in his interest while he's absent. So there's conflict between the Central Junta and the colonies. The bigger story, though, is that the French armies keep winning battles in this war. And eventually they really forced the Central Junta to disband and not just retreat, but to go into hiding so they don't get captured and executed. So when the Central Junta formally disbands itself in fear in 1810, they hand over power to what they call the Regency Council, which is really a council of advisors theoretically working for the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, to try to kind of control and direct and gain resources for the continuation of this revolutionary movement. So the Regency Council is largely another Spanish-type government that's going to try to run the war against France. And this council will write a whole new Spanish constitution, or at least will start the process in 1810. And that constitution will do a lot of Enlightenment type things. They'll guarantee kind of popular citizen rights and voting rights, because the Spanish are going to start, under this constitution, will start voting on a parliament, elected representatives, and the parliament will become known as the Cortes. And that parliament will supposedly represent not just the people in Spain itself, but will also hold elections in the colonies to elect colonists to come to Spain and take part in the Cortes, the parliament. And the Regency Council was hesitant to do that because once you give voting rights and representation to the colonies, that could get out of control because the colonies have a very large population and they represent a huge landmass compared to the size of Spain. So it's very quickly understood that if the colonies get their equal representation kind of per person as Spain does, then the colonies will actually have a majority in the parliament and they'll be able to just vote as a bloc and do whatever they want. So the Cortes in 1810, as they start to come together, they will formally declare Spain and the colonies as, quote, equal parts of one nation. So one people just living in different parts of the world. So that's a big quote that inspires a lot of colonists to kind of think of themselves not just as colonists, but as citizens in the Spanish Empire, with all the rights and privileges of any other Spanish citizen, no matter where they are. So the first Cortes will meet in fall of 1810, and they're the ones that will make this kind of equal parts of one nation statement. But then they start to get worried, and they're going to break down into a kind of argument that really never ends between how much power should the colonies have? Should they be allowed to take a majority in the Cortes, because then the Spanish government would be serving the colonies more than anything, because that would be the majority of the voting members in the Cortes. And of course, a lot of Iberians still really look down on the American colonists. They view them as kind of the rabble of Spain who couldn't make it on their own in Spain, so they have to go to the colonies to try to, make their money and gain power or something like that. But the bigger constitution will be finished, the Cortes will write that, and will be finished in 1812. So some textbooks call it the Constitution of Cadiz, where it was eventually kind of created and signed off on, or the Constitution of 1812. So again, that depends on which textbook you're looking in, which documentary or which historian you're talking to. So the Constitution of Cadiz is very much a kind of Enlightenment liberal document. It creates a separation of government powers, so there'll be a legislature and a court system and an executive. The Spanish monarchy, the Spanish king, will be the head of the executive branch. It creates full citizenship rights under the law. And the Constitution will give local autonomy to colonial governments. So the colonies are still part of the Spanish Empire, but will give those colonies a lot more leeway in making a lot of their own laws and kind of policies. And the problem is, though, that this Constitution and the Cortes at Cadiz, the Parliament, they're not the official government of Spain. They're like a revolutionary movement. They're leaders of this revolution. So who is the formal government of Spain? It's still the government that the Bonapartes run. So Napoleon probably has the most control over it, but his brother Joseph is still on the Spanish throne. So what does Napoleon think of this constitution? He hates it, because it's a statement of independence from the Spanish people and their representatives. So Napoleon wants to destroy this constitution because it's a threat to his control over Spain. And eventually he'll even release Ferdinand VII from that French palace in 1813 and send him back home to Spain, because he believes that Ferdinand VII hates his constitution also. So Napoleon basically wants to, throw a giant troublemaker into Spain to reclaim the Spanish throne, maybe, or some amount of authority, and so that he can argue against and destroy this constitution. Because Ferdinand VII, he doesn't really believe in citizenship and equality and all these full rights and whatnot. He's an absolutist. He wants as much power for the monarchy as he can possibly get, and he doesn't like the idea of sharing power with the legislature. So Napoleon knows that, and so he sends Ferdinand VII into Spain in 1813 to try to basically undercut the Constitution and undercut Spanish unity in fighting off the French. What happens after the Spanish king gets back into Spain in 1813? He's overwhelmed by larger problems out in the colonies, where you're going to start having fighting in the colonies also. There's still some French traders that are trying to get into the colonies. There's still some French diplomats that are trying to take over the colonies. So there's also civil wars that break out in the colonies during all this, in the early 18 teens. And these civil wars will have a couple of different kind of factions. And two of those factions fight against each other. And that's basically the Spanish revolutionaries who want to overthrow French control of Spain, versus French colonizers that are trying to come into the colonies and attach the colonies to the larger French Empire. So there's a civil war between kind of Spanish loyalists and French colonists. But the larger civil wars that start to break out in the colonies will really be between the Spanish and themselves. So between Spanish loyalists who want to, even if they talk about, having some local autonomy in their colony, they still want to be part of the Spanish Empire, and they still want to be under the authority of the Spanish king. And they will fight against the autonomists who want a full-scale revolution to break this colony away from the Spanish Empire and make it into a whole new country. So again, radicalism starts to grow in the 18 teens as a direct result of the instability of politics in Spain itself and in Europe itself. One big problem for a lot of those kind of autonomist and independence-driven movements in the colonies is the very fact that Napoleon's going to start losing in 1813. So there's I think it's the fourth or fifth coalition of major countries that all form a new alliance to attack Napoleon's forces in Europe. And again, they're most of the really big powers in Europe. So it's Britain gets involved in this, Russia, Prussia, which is the largest and most powerful of the German states, the German countries. Austria gets involved to the east. And even Sweden to the north gets involved in this. So really all the major powers form a new alliance, and they all start attacking Napoleon at the same time. And Napoleon's defeated several of these before. But for the first time in 20 years, he actually loses a battle himself personally at the Battle of Leipzig, out in the kind of middle of the German realm where this red dot is. So when Napoleon lost the Battle of Leipzig, that means that all these countries are marching against him. And when he lost at Leipzig, he basically has to go back into France itself and pull as many of the surviving French army back into France. Desperately hoping that he can defend Paris against all these foreign invaders. And his last ditch effort is to try to defend the French border so that he can at least be Emperor of France and stay on his throne, even though he's lost control over the rest of the colonies and the European areas he had gained control over just a few years before. But even though Napoleon is a military genius, his armies are much smaller than his enemies. He moves his armies around Paris and actually wins several battles against vastly larger European armies that are invading. So he continues showing his military genius really right up to the end, until those armies do take Paris and they defeat the French armies. And Napoleon is forced to abdicate in April 1814. So he's forced to retire, basically. And his conquerors, the people who took him out, send him into exile in 1814 to an island called Elba, which is way up at the top right of this map, just off the Italian coastline. So that's basically, the European powers didn't want to execute him, so they sent him into exile. They imprison him on this island, and they figure he's just going to live out the rest of his days there, so problem solved. Problem not solved, because he escapes the island one night and gets on basically a little rowboat and rows back to France with some of his supporters, and gets back into Paris and proclaims himself French emperor again. And he's going to try to be king of France basically again. The rest of the European powers aren't having that, so they rebuild their giant coalition and they all attack. They all attack Napoleon at a place called Waterloo, just on the other side of the French border. And again, Napoleon faces a gigantic, overwhelming enemy, and he barely loses. So again, he's showing he's a military genius and really fighting it to a draw for most of the day. But his forces are eventually just overwhelmed at the end of the day. And he's forced to abdicate again. And this time the Europeans aren't screwing around. They're going to put him into exile in 1815 at the island of St. Helena, which is much, much further down in the South Atlantic. because they figure having him too close to Europe would be dangerous. So they imprison him on this little rock out in the middle of the southern Atlantic Ocean. And so he's put there in 1815, and he dies fairly mysteriously a few years later, like 1821, 22, something like that. I don't remember the exact year. But there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theories that he was poisoned or something like that, just to take him out, so he really wouldn't be a problem anymore. But we really don't know exactly what happened to him on that island. But he did die on that island just a few years after he's imprisoned there in 1815. So Napoleon's out of the picture. And of course that brings independence back to Spain. They've won their independence movement. And their king, Ferdinand VII, gets back onto his throne in 1814 when Napoleon was first defeated. And he's going to run the country as king. His problem, though, for the kind of short and long term for the rest of his life, is he is king under the Constitution of 1812. So he doesn't really like that, because the Constitution limits the monarchy's power. And he's friends with a lot of the Spanish elite, the big landowners, who are very conservative, and they hate the Constitution, so they advise him to get rid of it, to trash it. And he does that in 1814. He overthrows the Constitution himself, and he declares really a kind of whole new government under his leadership, and that'll be an absolutist government. So it's going to be a full monarchy. And so Ferdinand VII shows kind of his true colors. He'll make promises of citizen equality and kind of elected legislature and all that, but when he gets the chance, he gets rid of all that stuff to maintain power for his own position. So he will basically run Spain as an absolutist monarch. He tries to rebuild his absolutist powers as much as possible, and he also tries to regain control over all these American colonies that have started rebellion movements in the 18-teens. He really fails at both of those, so there's a lot of government instability, and there is a liberal revolt against him in 1820 where they really take him prisoner, and they threaten to do things to him unless he promises to restore the old Constitution. So under personal threat, he agreed to do that. So in 1820, the Constitution of Cadiz comes back, and you get the representative government, the voting rights, the citizen rights again, but the king is still the executive branch. So the king doesn't appear to like this very much. He only put up with it because they threatened him, and that was his kind of escape from being murdered or something, very literally. So he's still in the executive branch. He's running the executive branch of government. He's enforcing the laws and running foreign policy and all that normal executive branch duties. Until a new French king comes into power, and in 1823 decides to try to get Spain back as an absolutist country. So France, the French king in 1823, sends a French army into Spain to kind of release Ferdinand VII from his captors, or what he calls his captors, and really put him back on his absolutist throne and give him back all those powers. And he's very open to this idea. So Ferdinand VII makes a deal with the French government, the French king, basically to keep a French army in Spain to enforce the return of his powers, and he again gets rid of the Constitution and starts up a new absolutist state. And that's really where Spain will stay for the next 10 years until Ferdinand VII dies in 1833. He is dependent, reliant on a foreign French army, really to keep him on his throne, because his getting rid of the Constitution again really outraged a lot of the Spanish population. So we see Ferdinand VII kind of going back and forth regarding the Constitution or absolutism, depending on the circumstances of the moment. But in every instance where he has an opportunity to get rid of the Constitution, it appears that he does. So that's kind of the longer term for the Spanish government. And that's the kind of background that we're going to have to understand in order to analyze the major independence revolution movements, colonies that we'll talk about over the next several lectures that will kind of create independence for a lot of those colonies and will make them into the new countries that, as they are born, we will end this module and end this class with. So next time we'll start with those revolutionary movements.